Hello, today we are going to talk about what is deviance. So when we're talking about what deviant behavior is, first, we need to talk about deviance as a violation of some social rule. More than just a violation, though, deviant behavior evokes some sort of response. So it evokes disapproval, anger, indignation. Usually it's a negative response. We're going to talk a little bit about why it's not necessarily always a negative response, but it evokes some social response to kind of sanction our behavior. It's not even necessarily that you're breaking some official rule. So it can just be that you are rubbing someone the wrong way. So for example, someone with very visible facial scar can be considered deviant and will evoke some sort of a social response. Even if that's where people try to turn away or they don't want to look at it, they're uncomfortable, it evokes a response. But there's no rule against having lots of scars. And deviant behavior can be positive deviance. So we could label people as a genius or a saint. Those are out of the norm. They are deviant. They're not like the rest of us, but in a positive way. So creative artists or glamorous celebrities can sometimes be considered part of this deviant group or engaging in deviant behavior. In fact, the label that we put on the behavior may be less important than the power of the label to evoke a response, to control our behavior. So it's not even necessarily what we call that behavior or the people that we're labeling as deviant. It's the power of that label to determine our behavior, to encourage us to act differently towards people who are deviant, or encourage us to act differently when we are labeled as deviant. So we're going to talk about two core perspectives on defining deviance and how to understand deviant behavior. The first is the positivist or normative camp, and the three assumptions there are about absolutism, objectivism, and determinism. The other camp is the relativist or the constructionist camp, and the three assumptions there are relativism, subjectivism, and voluntarism. We're going to talk about each of those. So let's start first with that positive or normative camp. So first, positivism is about empirical evidence for something. In criminology, the positivist camp is about empirical evidence distinguishing criminals from non-criminals. So in early criminology, this had to do with physical features where criminologists would look at the shape of the skull or the kinds of facial features that someone had to distinguish a criminal from a non-criminal. We don't do that anymore. But in this positivist camp, we look for evidence. We look for evidence of behavior, of how people are acting. It is about collecting observations about criminal behavior or deviant behavior that helps us determine what is criminal, what is non-criminal, what's deviant, what's not deviant. This camp is considered what's called normative, and this is where I have a little bit of a challenge with this, but the idea behind this normative conception is that there is a general set of norms or behaviors, conduct or conditions on which all individuals can agree. So we can all agree that some behaviors are deviant and others are not. Now, the problem that I have with this is that human beings can't agree on anything. I mean, large groups of people, of course, can agree on something, and that's where we are with this idea of the normative conception of deviance. So for example, probably most of us would agree that murder is deviant behavior. Incest is deviant behavior. We would agree that those things are bad and wrong. However, we know that there's differences in how we understand all of those behaviors, and that somewhere in the world, there are groups that don't agree that those behaviors are bad or wrong. I mean, you can look at examples in popular culture, like if you've seen Game of Thrones, boy, there's murder and incest all through that thing. And you watch it and you're like, yeah, okay, makes sense. So not exactly normative. Nonetheless, this group does believe in ideas of universal conceptions of deviance, that everybody agrees on these deviant categories. So this group embraces this concept of absolutism, where deviance is absolutely real. You don't just make it up. You don't just decide that something's deviant or something isn't. You can see evidence of it. You have clear guidelines about what's deviant, what's not, that there absolutely is an action or person or group that is deviant, that what they're doing is out of the norm. This group also embraces objectivism. So deviance is an observable object. It's not personally influenced. It's not that I feel one way and you feel another way, that it is objectively a deviant behavior. And as such, that means we can observe it. We can study it scientifically. So much more likely to have clear definitions about what's deviant, what's not, and to look at it much more objectively. And then finally, this camp, at least historically, has looked at the causes of deviant behavior as being determined by forces that are outside of the individual's control. This wasn't always the case, and there are still camps in this positivist group that talk about internal factors, biology, personality, that encourage people to act deviant. But this camp does look at the idea of external forces that constrain our behavior and encourage us to engage in deviant behavior. That it's not just that we decide we're going to be deviant, that there are conditions that are presented to us that encourage this kind of deviant behavior. On the other end of the spectrum is the constructionist or relativist perspective. So this perspective really embraces this concept of relativism. So deviant behavior does not have any intrinsic characteristics unless the behavior is thought to have those characteristics. So it's really about what a society decides, that we, through our interactions, decide some behaviors are deviant and some behaviors are not. So this camp really focuses on deviant behavior as behavior that is labeled as deviant. So you can engage in any number of activities and behaviors. It isn't until we put a label on it saying that this is deviant that it becomes deviant behavior. And that label is relative to a culture, to a set of norms, to a set of beliefs. So it's not that there are things that are universally deviant. It's that a culture has decided that in our culture, this is an important value. And so we're going to label this activity deviant and this other activity not deviant. Because of that variation, of that relativeness, it means that deviant behavior is inherently subjective. So deviant behavior is a subjective experience. When we are deviant, we are experiencing that deviant behavior. It is based on our lived experiences. It's based on our perception, our feeling. It's happening to us. It's a very personal sort of experience. Same thing when we are observing our reactions to others, when we're reacting to other people, it's a subjective experience. Now, because of that, when we study deviance as researchers, we have to acknowledge what our subjective position is. What are we relative to the deviant person, to the culture, to the values and beliefs that are triggered by this deviant behavior? We have to explore our own subjectivity. And when we talk about deviant behavior, when we talk about deviance, we should approach that behavior with empathy, because that person is dealing with some experience that they're having some experience that led them to deviance, or they're having an experience that is deviant. And so approaching that with some level of empathetic understanding can help us untangle the deviance overall. And then finally, this perspective is marked by voluntarism. So engaging in deviant behavior is voluntary. So we have free will in this. We have self-directed motives and behaviors and actions, instead of it being determined by either our biology, our internal circumstances, or determined by our external circumstances. We have the autonomy to choose to engage in deviance or not engage in deviance. More helpful, though, is to look at these as an integrated view. So even in these camps, these two camps do not just focus on their differences and say that we are completely opposite in these two camps. However, they argue that what's special about their camp is more important. So they can recognize the argument of the other camp, so they can see that there is an objective and a subjective element to deviant behavior. It's just that the positivists are going to say that the objective element much more important. The subjective, the relativists are going to say that that subjective component is much more important. But they are both right. So a deviant act is both a real act and a label. If there is no real act of deviance, then there's no deviant behavior. But likewise, even if there is deviant behavior, if we don't label it as deviant, it's still not considered deviant. So both of them work together, actually. And it might be helpful to think about them in terms of when they're most appropriate. So the positivist view is probably more relevant to the study of serious types of deviance, like murder or rape or armed robbery. In those cases, looking at objective elements is probably a little bit easier for one and probably more helpful. On the other hand, when we're talking about less serious kinds of deviance, the constructionist view might be more appropriate. So when we're looking at deviance that doesn't really cause grave harm to others, like adulterers or prostitutes, strippers, drug users, that kind of thing, then looking at the mindset, the subjective experience, the relative nature of deviance might be more helpful. Now, there is a third conception of deviance, and that's the critical conception. This conception of deviance really critiques the existing social system that creates norms of oppression and then creates different kinds of deviance based on that social structure. So they would argue that activities and people that are defined as deviant really reflect the views of the powerful. So it's not just that deviance is created in a vacuum. We label some activities as deviant, and the critical perspective argues that those activities that we focus on as deviant are focused that way because that is in the vested view of the powerful. So powerful people allow us to focus on certain kinds of deviance and not think about other activities as deviant. And in fact, they would argue that law, crime, and punishment produce and perpetuate larger social inequalities. So one example is the sentencing for cocaine. So if you sell 500 grams of powder cocaine, there's a mandatory 5-year sentence. But the sale of only 5 grams of crack cocaine carries the same sentence. There's a lot of reasons for this. It started with the war on drugs really in the 70s in the US. The 1980s was a big time for cocaine, particularly crack cocaine. And crack cocaine is a much more concentrated form of cocaine. It's cheaper, it's easier to produce. And so as a result, rich people tend to use powder cocaine and poor people tend to use crack cocaine. Crack cocaine in its concentrated form also has some very serious repercussions, health repercussions. It's more addictive. There's all kinds of other problems. So that's one of the reasons that there's this disparity in sentencing. But what it ends up meaning is that wealthy people get lighter sentences than poor people. And especially during the 1980s, crack cocaine was really associated with the African-American population. There's lots of reasons for that have to do with social structure and larger systems of inequality. That means that poor and African-Americans are much more likely to get a much more severe sentence for using crack cocaine because they use crack instead of powder cocaine. So the critical perspective would say this kind of disparity really favors the rich. It favors the powerful people, and it punishes poor people or people with less social power much more severely. In any case, when we're talking about deviance, we should really think about deviance as a continuum. So deviant behavior is any behavior that's considered deviant by a public consensus, and that can range from a maximum to a minimum. So we can talk about total deviance on one side and then total conformity on the other side. Most of us fall somewhere in the middle. We've all engaged in some kind of deviant behavior, but probably not to the extreme of being completely deviant, but also not the extreme of being completely conforming. It's a spectrum of deviance. When we're talking about that kind of deviant behavior, it's important to recognize that when we're dealing with deviance as a norm violation, norms are not all equal. Violating some norms is much more serious than violating other norms. So folkways are everyday norms. They're violating these kind of norms, violating folkways is very minor. It's daily behaviors about how we're supposed to interact. It's about like the rules of engaging in an elevator, or how you stand in line, or how you're supposed to greet someone. They are our everyday form of behavior. Violating a norm like that will engage some sort of social interaction. It will engage some sort of social sanction, but it's very informal. It's usually like people roll their eyes at you, or they give you a dirty look or something like that. The social sanctions are minor. Violating these norms is pretty minor. On the other hand, there are mores. So mores are moral norms. These are things that a society holds most dear. They're the most important norms. You violate one of these norms, the social sanctions are really severe, and they are often criminal, as a matter of fact. So that leads to the next one. Laws tend to be our mores codified into the legal system, so backed by official sanctions. Not always, of course, there's variation in all of these. Some of our folkways are actually laws, and some of our mores are not laws. There's kind of some variation, but typically laws are our mores, the things that we most value as a culture. So if you break a law, you can go to jail, or there's legal consequences. The sanctions are much more official and much more severe than violating the folkways. So then that leads us to this question of what's the difference between deviance and crime? So how does deviance differ from crime? Well, first, crime always involves violating the law. That's one of the defining characteristics. The difference between crime and deviance on that spectrum, crime involves violating the law. So crime is a violation of a formal norm. Deviance is more typically a violation of an informal norm. And in fact, there are many more deviant acts than there are criminal acts. Like I said, we have all of us been deviant. We've engaged in some deviant behavior, but not all of us are criminals. Or are we? The other part of this is that not all crimes are actually deviant. So for example, speeding, driving too fast, that is a criminal act. There are speed limits that say you're only supposed to drive this speed or below. Most people, almost everybody, drives above the speed limit. As a matter of fact, it's become part of the rule of traffic. You drive with the flow of traffic, which means that everybody is engaging in criminal behavior because they're violating the law. But we don't really care. It doesn't matter that much. It is still illegal, though. You could still get fined. You could get pulled over by a police officer. It's just that it's really not deviant. It's very typical to engage in those kinds of behaviors. So that's it. We have talked about deviance, what we consider deviant. The take-home message really is about deviance being a violation of social norms, but not all norms are created equal.